intended to influence the outcome of the upcoming polls. The opposition says the government has blood on its hands, that they have been lax with security measures. The government has also suggested that the Kurdish militants themselves from the PKK could have been behind this coordinated bombing. The government is also blaming the ISIS. How important is the ISIS factor here? Because if we, go by the kind of explosives that's been used, and if you look at the target, it seems to have the hallmark of the Islamic State.
Yeah, well, it's two suicide bombers, so the assumption is that normally that's the hallmark of the ISIS or Islamic jihadi groups. The Kurds have generally not used suicide bombers. And the far left groups, which at one point are also being accused, don't use them at all. But as you mentioned, the opposition suspects that the government itself may be responsible, or at least have allowed the attack to happen because they may have potential benefits politically. So nobody's quite certain as to why or who exactly is responsible. But as the ambassador has mentioned, it's really what is interesting about the explosion is not so much the external situation in Turkey, that's a factor. It's really how it's playing in the political sphere. As has been mentioned, it's the domestic politics of Turkey that is really now the big question mark or driving force behind a lot of this. Erdogan is in fact fighting for his political life. He was unable to win a majority in the last election. And the rise of the Kurdish parties, which were able to grab 13% of the vote, his inability to form a coalition government, or unwillingness to form a coalition government because he would have had to work with the secular parties, indicates that in this coming election he will both seek to obviously try to get his own majority. If he can't, he'll probably form an alliance with the Turkish nationalist parties who are anti-Kurdish. And so if that's the case, the argument that is being made by his opponents is that he's using this explosion to, in effect, build up nationalist sentiment and fear of instability within the Turkish population and win. Who knows how that will work out, because it seems to be it may work in the other direction, where you may see a strong reaction against him. And as you've mentioned, there have been protests in most of the major cities. The cities themselves don't matter to Erdogan that much. He doesn't win his votes from the cities. He wins his vote from the rural and the small town Anatolian provinces in the south and the central Anatolian area. That group, it's not clear whether or not they necessarily buy this argument. But it'll be a very tight election, and for Erdogan it's now an extremely difficult position, because he has, as I've mentioned, domestically he now has to form an alliance with a Turkish nationalist group or parties with whom he's not necessarily had a great relationship with. But on the other hand, if the opposition, the secular parties and the Kurds are able to increase their vote, then Turkey may end up going for a third election because they simply don't have anybody who may be strong enough to put together a government, or the opposition may put together a government and rule in its place. The Kurds, it's interesting he's blaming the Kurds, because one of the problems that he's facing is that despite the fact that he has carried out bomb attacks on the Kurds, remember he began bombing the Kurds as well as the IS a few months ago, the Kurds have refused to respond. In fact, the PKK had announced just before the bomb blast a ceasefire. And they had, because the Kurds understand that his political game is very straightforward. He wants the Kurds to attack. He wants the Kurdish militant groups to carry out attacks in Turkey, because then that will trigger the nationalist sentiment that he needs to win his election. So that's why everybody's looking at, a lot of Turks are saying, well, he didn't get that reaction, quite the opposite. The Kurds, realizing the game, tactically moved in the other direction. So then he staged his own bombing, and that's their argument, to trigger the kind of reaction that the Kurds are not giving him. And so if the Kurds have declared a ceasefire, their argument is, why in the world would they carry out a bomb blast in the middle of Ankara? It doesn't make any sense. So that's the domestic environment. But the foreign environment, I'll just add, is also quite negative for him, because the intervention of Russia, the refusal of America to intervene, means that his entire game plan in the Middle East has completely fallen apart. Right? His belief that he could bring down the Syrian government, establish Turkey as the dominant Islamic power in that area, has gone nowhere. In fact, it's proven quite the opposite. Syria has collapsed, there's no doubt about it, but Assad is still holding on to a little rump of the state.
Right.
And with Russian intervention, it's very likely that Assad will hang on for quite some more time to come.
Absolutely, with Russia upping the ante in Syria. Ambassador, a quick word from you on the ISIS angle here. If it were indeed the Islamic State behind these attacks, although it's entirely speculative, it's clearly going to mark a major uptick in the states in the stakes with the ISIS extending into Turkey.
Yes, as Ritam has pointed out, the Russians are very much active now, but at the same time the Americans are also, I believe, negotiating with the Russians so that they can have some kind of a joint agreement on declaring some areas which are in the as no-fly zone area. And so now, as Islamic State is an organization which is worrying everyone, it's only that the Russians want to maintain the status quo